buddy.
Well, hey folks, thanks again for checking out the video. I ended up finishing that day 2 of the Montana Bass Nation tournament with, I'm looking it up here, 25.04 pounds for my top 5 fish. Ended up in first place overall with 52 pounds for the 10 fish between the 2 days. Had a blast. Thanks again to Montana Bass Nation. And Mike Dominic for helping, run the thing, and everybody that, from taking pictures, just participating in the event in general. It was a relatively small turnout, but lots of big effort and big fish, like I was saying before, and I hope to get a few more people out. It's some of the very best smallmouth fishing anywhere. And you saw a lot of my catches there. There was a reasonable number of them in the afternoon that I don't know what I did to the footage, but it wasn't there. So all my afternoon footage, like the last 2-3 hours, was not there. I probably had 1 or 2 that ended up making the cut for my top 5 during that time period. Anyways, it's a blast out there. I love fishing out there. It's a really hard place to beat come late summer and early fall especially. So yeah. Once again, if you are interested in tournament bass fishing in Montana, please look up Montana Bass Nation. You can look them up at montanabass.com. You can check them out on Facebook. And yeah, so gonna give you a couple tips here just to kind of finish off the video. You can catch smallmouth out there with all sorts of techniques, from little itty bitty finesse stuff to big baits. power fishing, finesse fishing, shallow, deep. A lot of what I was fishing was kind of deeper structure with a variety of techniques. But being the recent history, what just happened at the Bassmaster Classic, I'm going to take a little time to divulge just a couple things on some variations of the moping technique that I use on Fort Peck to put tons of fish in the boat. So, just recently, I hope you watched if you're a bass fisherman or at least heard the news, but Jeff Gustafson, congrats to him, won the Bassmaster Classic on the Tennessee River out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and he did it with the kind of moping style technique, something he's very well known for, does like crazy up, on Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods, stuff like that. It's a technique that, I mean, at its roots has been around forever. Nothing new, nothing special. Ultimately, what it's all about is precision placement of your baits in front of fish. 2D sonar has been around forever, and guys have been doing this on 2D sonar forever. Dropping it down to the fish, holding over their heads, working the fish, video gaming them to get them to bite. More recent history, I think a lot of people in bass fishing call it like the Demiki rig. Additionally, nowadays with forward-facing sonar and whatnot, it's a lot more common to be casting this presentation and working it over fish, as well as fishing it vertically. Variations of this technique is something that I've used to put piles of fish in the boat at Fort Peck. I think some people view it as a little bit boring, but honestly, like, I guess I don't mind, if you're catching tons of fish, I don't find that boring, number one. Number two, I find it extremely engaging, especially, if you're the one doing it, because, like, most of the time, whether it's on 2D sonar, straight vertical, or if you are using forward-facing sonar, it's extremely visual, because you're literally reacting to the fish and what they do, reacting with your bait to get them into striking. Now, the technique moping, I'm pretty sure Ron Linder came up with the terminology, and I've loved watching the Linder show forever. I've enjoyed watching Jeff Gustafson. Both those guys were huge influences on my fishing, especially a lot of like early on stuff at Fort Peck. I've done a lot of moping at Fort Peck, and you can look up videos that the Linders have done on this from years ago. If you go to Linder's Angling Edge, look up videos on this. But I've adopted kind of my own styles, my own techniques, and but yeah, variations of moping to this day is still something I use to put tons of fish in the boat, including the 2 days of this tournament. So yeah, the moping technique, I think the name, because Ron's sons, I think Jim Linder and Bill Linder, and they were crushing fish in tournaments, and I think you were just kind of like joking around, like, yeah, you guys are out there just moping around with these little minnow baits and jacking these bass, and so I kind of got called moping or hanging a minnow, Demiki rigging, stuff like that. Whatever it's called, it's done with a pretty much a 90-degree jig and some sort of trailer. Pretty much a soft plastic minnow trailer. Now, I use a wide variety of trailers. I do a lot of this stuff, whether it's straight vertical on 2D, working the fish up and down, or casting. Put tons of fish in the boat this way. A lot of the fish on Fort Peck are eating like 4 to 8 inch Cisco. They're very much used to feeding up. And minnow imitating presentations, whether it's straight tail presentations, swim baits, everything in between is great. Now, when it comes to smallmouth fishing overall, a couple things to keep in mind, and this includes Fort Peck. What I tell people, like, to keep it basic, is you got to keep a few things in mind, and not much. If you're in the right area, the question is, do they want it on the bottom? Are they looking down? Or do they want it, swimming over their head where they're looking up? Fish that are targeting crayfish, sculpins, if you're out in the Great Lakes, gobies, or if they're just in a neutral to negative mood, might want stuff in the bottom for whatever reason. Fish that might be active on bait fish that are like kind of more the pelagic style bait fish up high, a lot of times they're triggered by chasing up for bait fish. So keep in mind, does the smallmouth want it on the bottom or does it want it over his head? And that can change moment to moment, spot by spot, day to day. You got to keep that in mind. It can all change really quick. Additionally, do they want a bait that is more of a subtle bait or something that's more reactionary? So keep that in mind. Do they want it on the bottom or do they want it over their head? Do they want it more subtle or do they want it more reactionary? If you keep that in mind, if you have a few baits that cover that spectrum, in most instances, you're going to be able to put smallies in the boat. Generally speaking, kind of like ballpark, know what their prey is, have a few of those options, you're probably going to catch them. So now when it comes to like I said, I use all sorts of things, and you can catch them on all sorts of things on Fort Peck. But you know, with the recent news at the Bassmaster Classic, figured I'd kind of touch on this a little bit just for fun. I'm going to start out showing you something that is not what people think of as a stereotypical moping bait. And actually, I'm not even going to show you a lot of baits. I'm mostly going to focus on the jig heads themselves. This is an extremely versatile tool, which works very well also in moping situations and in Damiki style situations, etc. As well as typical situations that it's known for, and that's a tube jig. So this tube jig is a Provider tackle tube jig. It's a 3/8 ounce. That's my go-to. It has a 90-degree head, which is key. Interestingly, most Damiki style, moping style baits, the eye for the hook is going to be balanced in the bait. This one is not. However, with the bulk of a tube and the hollow tube, it really tends to float up quite a bit to begin with. And tubes can get so erratic that if you are working them quickly, it can get too erratic where the bait wants to like twirl. This head, I can't tell you how much I like this head for tubes, is something that I can cast out, drag along the bottom, and with this 90-degree head, it tends to catch and kind of work up over those rocks. I really like the 90-degree head for dragging, but I also really like it, like I said, for the Damiki style technique. A tube is a great kind of like ballpark imitation of bait fish. And the really cool thing with a tube as compared to like a traditional soft, just jerk bait, fluke tail style minnow, is you can get lots of spiraling, shimmying, and darting that you can't always attain with, certain just generic fluke tails. Some of those you kind of can with some of that stuff, but a tube has its own look. And fishing it vertically, whether you're dead sticking it, whether you're actively working fish up and down, casting it, working it over their heads, or as a traditional tube dragging along the bottom or snapping off the bottom, this is one of my #1 techniques at Fort Peck, just to be honest. I mean, I catch more and bigger fish on this day in, day out than anything. Part of it is because I can go from dragging it to swimming it to vertical fishing it, and this in like moping Damiki style techniques works incredibly well, and it's not something that's really used. So yeah, this is the Provider tackle jig head. I'm not focusing as much on the soft plastics today. I'll let you guys experiment with that yourself. Each bait and technique balanced with your specific tackle is the recipe that you're going to use, and you need to really take the time to like view the lure in the water and see how it reacts to like your jigs when it's dead sticked, things like that. Also keeping in mind that water temperature, the density of the water, etc. changes. So just because it works in the heat of summer, it might look a little different in the cold weather in like late fall, for example. So not your stereotypical moping or Damiki style bait, but it works super good. Okay, so now that I just touched on the tube, which is definitely not your stereotypical moping or Damiki style bait, but works really well, I'm going to touch on a couple of really good moping style jig heads. This right here, this is a 3/8 ounce Smeltinator, same style jig that Jeff Gustafson just used in the Bassmaster Classic. This has got the 3/0 Gamakatsu 604. This is a Nishini Lure Works smelt head, 3/8 ounce as well, just for comparative purposes, with a 2/0 owner hook. Both these are extremely good presentations, but sometimes I'll pick one over the other, and I'll tell you why. Back it up just a smidge. This is kind of like a, let's just say the eye of the hook is coming off at approximately like a 30-degree angle on this swim bait head. This head is not what you use for typical Damiki or moping style techniques, because if you are hanging it vertically, it's going to tend to just droop down. Just kind of look like a blah. Not say it can't catch fish, but definitely not your go-to. This could be a good swimming, bait for a swim bait. Swim baits work really well, for Peck, many places. And that line tie has a big impact on how your swim bait looks going through the water. But as a general rule, this is not your go-to Damiki style or moping style head, because it'll droop down. That's where those 90-degree jig heads come into play. Okay, so to compare the two baits just a little bit, both are great baits, just have kind of a little different time and place. I'm going to show you at the rut a little bit of the difference. This is a 90-degree ball head jig. This is a 90-degree darter head jig. Depending on the trailer that you use, if you have a glidey style fluke trailer with a darter head, a lot of times it will glide on the drop. It will spiral on the drop, or as you jig it, sometimes it will get darty. Usually the more elongated the head is, or the flatter the head is, the more erratic the potential for your presentation has. Whereas a ball head, on the other hand, I don't want to say that it deadens the action, but ball heads tend to make it very plain. Like for example, if you're jigging a ball head, it's going to tend to just go work in a straight line, not sliding and gliding to the left and right, not darting, not flipping on its side, etc. Where darter heads or flattened jigs will tend to get glidier, turn to the side, dart, spiral on the drop, etc. So as I was saying earlier, when it comes to smallmouth, sometimes you want a more subtle approach. Sometimes you want things that have little reactionary moves built in. This is going to give you a more subtle, straight, approach right here. This will allow more of a reactionary style approach. It can be fairly subtle, but the difference between just falling or spiraling or gliding side to side, or darting, which a lot of bait fishers that are escaping do a little side to side darting, can be a big player. Sometimes they might want it more subtle. Sometimes they might want a little bit more action to it. So the Smeltinator right here, this is what Jeff Gustafson used in the Classic, is a very good bait. And I would say that it definitely, the placement of the eye, the shape of the head, definitely functions a lot more like a ball head jig. It is flattened, so compressed compared to a ball head, so you can get a little bit more out of it than say a ball head. But as a general rule, this bait is going to tend to come straight in. As you work it, it's going to tend to come straight at you. Not a lot of slide, glide, or rolling. It does have flat sides, so it can get a little bit of that to it. With a swim bait head, if you put a paddle tail on instead of a straight tail, if you're just swim baiting with it, you will get a little bit of that side to side with that 90-degree head. But anyways, the gist is it generally functions a little bit more like a really dressed up ball head jig. Good trailer keeper, a little fancy eyes, articulated gill pattern, good quality hook, good 90-degree head, great Moping and Debiki style bait if you want a bait coming straight in. Take the Nishini Lure Works head, for example. You can see this, compared to this, has a more elongated section right here, like a darter head, and very flattened sides. Depending on the trailer, you can get this thing to work more erratically. With some more gliding, darting, flipping on the side, things like that, depending on how you're working the bait. Some days that might be a good thing, some days that might be a bad thing. But this allows a little bit more of that erratic action at times from your bait. These Nishini Lure Works smelt heads, as you go up in size, especially the 5/8, you can get it to work very erratically. The 3, this is the 3/7 actually, technically slightly heavier than this one. Most of the darting action stuff is fairly subtle, but you can get that with this as opposed to this where it tends to come straight in. Personally for me, I tend to reach for this most of the time because I feel like if I need to, I can get it to do little darts, little quivers, little side shimmies that help in triggering fish that sometimes won't just bite something coming straight in. Both are great baits. Both, have their time and place. Just kind of comparing the difference between like a ball style head and more of a darter style head right here. The other thing to keep in mind, and I use all sorts of trailers, some that that'll just come straight in, up and down, some that'll dart, sometimes I'm just swim baiting with paddle tails. But when it comes to trailers, something I'm going to compare really quick. The trailer has a big influence on your presentation. So this, for example, is a Nishini Lure Works drop shot minnow, and this is a Lunker City finesse fish. You see this tail being droopier and this one being stiffer? This has a lot of action, so like if it's coming straight in, that tail is twitching, very soft, very pliable, lots of like undulations for a straight tail. Also in cold water, as it stiffens up, this just has a great action and a great darting action with this bait. Whereas this bait, but if the water gets really warm, this bait softens up, and if you want a darting action, you get less of it because this bait is so soft. So over like 64-degree water, I don't get as much darting from this. So if I don't want darting, that's a good thing. If I want darting, I might have to go to a stiffer plastic like this Lunker City Finesse fish, just to show you the difference. Your trailer has a big impact on how your bait works. If you want it to just come straight in, it's not as big of a deal. If you want little darts, little quivers, side shimmies, stuff like that, tinkering around with your trailers is key. And there's a lot of instances where you can turn lookers into biters by giving them something that all of a sudden they're following, and then it darts to the side and they can eat it. That can be the case when you're working it vertically. When you're working it vertically, it might just take that little glide out to the side. Depending on the head and the trailer, it might make a bigger glide. But anyways, that's just a little breakdown on some differences between two different style heads. The trailer is something to keep in mind in terms of like, not every, you know, moping style head and Damiki style head is created equal. They can all have their time and place depending on what you're looking for action. One might be better than the other. If you're fishing with a buddy, it might be good to have one of each. Try them throughout the day, mix it up, you know, but just keep in mind, like, if you are struggling to get fish to react, sometimes, especially on the cast or vertical, sometimes those glides when you're jigging, like moping to me, dead sticking the bait works fantastic. I catch tons of fish dead sticking baits like this with various trailers. But when I'm casting it or actively working it, when you're dead sticking it, there's not much of a difference with these baits. Not much at all. Just mostly the hook in it. Maybe a little bit of the aesthetics. But when it comes to actively working the fish, a lot of times when they're not eating, I am watching that fish and reacting to the fish to see what it'll take to trigger. I might work that fish super high in the water column. I might drop it down. Typically with this technique, you're working above their heads. Not to say you always have to work it above their heads. But whether it's casting, going vertical, a lot of times I'm working fish up and down and up and down. Or if I'm casting, I might work them all the way back to the boat before I eventually get them, you know, to trigger into striking. So anyways, just leaving you with a few tips on some of the subtle differences between jig head styles. And yeah, that technique along with both these heads, I've been kind of referencing it, but both these heads can work really well for putting swim baits on as well. So you can go take a trailer off, a straight tail trailer that you might be using for more of a moping or Damiki style technique, to a swim bait style trailer with the same jig head and wallop the fish. So anyways, thanks for watching. You guys have a good one.